Ma'am, I've asked you twice already. What are you doing here?
I'm sitting on a bench in a public park. Is that suddenly illegal?
Don't get smart with me. Multiple people called about someone suspicious in the area.
Suspicious? I'm literally reading a book.
Look, this is a nice neighborhood. Residents here pay good money for their homes. They have a right.
The body camera captured everything, every word, every movement, and Officer Brandon Cole had absolutely no idea that the woman he was about to handcuff had spent the last 4 years investigating police departments for the Department of Justice. The woman sitting on that bench wasn't panicking. She wasn't running. She wasn't begging. She was Dr. Aisha Rahman, and she had dismantled discriminatory policing practices in 7 cities. She had secured federal consent decrees against entire departments. She had testified before Congress about religious profiling in law enforcement, and now she was about to become the lead witness in a federal civil rights case that would cost Denver a consent decree and end multiple careers. Before we go any further, drop your city or state in the comments and hit that subscribe button because you're about to see how assumptions destroy careers. This story is absolutely wild. Dr. Aisha Rahman was 39 years old, born in Detroit, raised by Somali immigrant parents who'd fled civil war in the 90s. She wore a hijab every day, a fact that would become central to what happened next. She'd earned her doctorate in criminology from Georgetown University, spent 6 years as a prosecutor in the US Attorney's Office, and for the past 4 years, had been investigating civil rights violations across the country for the DOJ. Aisha was brilliant at her job. She had a conviction rate of 94% on the cases she built. She'd helped dismantle discriminatory policing practices in 7 different cities. She knew the law better than most judges, and she had a particular skill for documenting encounters in ways that would hold up in federal court. That Saturday, Aisha was in Denver following up on a pattern of complaints. Over the previous 18 months, the DOJ had received 47 formal complaints about the Denver Police Department's treatment of Muslim residents, particularly women wearing hijabs. The complaints described harassment, unlawful stops, demands for identification without cause, and what multiple complainants described as a clear pattern of religious discrimination. Aisha's job was to determine if these complaints had merit, so she did what she always did. She went undercover. No DOJ credentials visible, no announcement of her presence. Just a woman in a hijab, sitting in public spaces, documenting what happened. She'd been sitting on that bench in Washington Park for about 20 minutes. She was actually reading a book about constitutional law, appropriately enough. The park was busy, families having picnics, kids playing soccer, joggers on the paths. Aisha blended in perfectly. She wasn't bothering anyone. She wasn't doing anything remotely suspicious. Her book bag, sitting beside her on the bench, contained something most people's bags don't: professional-grade recording equipment. 3 small cameras, 2 audio recorders, a GPS tracker logging her exact location, and a device that would automatically upload everything to DOJ servers in real time. Every word, every gesture, every moment was being documented and transmitted to federal investigators 1,400 miles away in Washington, D.C. Officer Brandon Cole had been with Denver PD for 14 years. He was assigned to the park's patrol district, a wealthy neighborhood with expensive homes and vocal residents. Brandon was 38 years old, married with 2 kids, and by all outward appearances, a typical suburban cop. His record showed 2 commendations for community service, one for rescue during a flood, and a generally clean disciplinary history. One written warning 3 years ago for inappropriate comments during a community meeting, but nothing that raised major red flags. What his record didn't show was the pattern. Because Brandon had never been investigated thoroughly enough for anyone to see it, he stopped Muslim women at a rate 6 times higher than the district average. He ran names through terrorism databases on the flimsiest pretexts. He'd filed suspicious activity reports on 17 different Muslim residents over 3 years, none of which led to anything because none were based on actual suspicious activity. Brandon's patrol partner that day was Officer Jessica Torres, a 5-year veteran who'd been paired with Brandon for the past 8 months. Jessica had noticed things. The way Brandon's entire demeanor changed when he saw women in hijabs, the comments he'd make in the patrol car, the extra scrutiny he'd apply to certain people while ignoring identical behavior from others. She'd never said anything officially, but she'd started keeping her own notes just in case. That Saturday afternoon, Brandon and Jessica were parked near the park's north entrance when Brandon's radio crackled. A call from dispatch. Suspicious person reported at Washington Park, south side near the lake. Caller states an individual has been sitting alone for an extended period, described as Middle Eastern appearance, possibly surveilling the area. Brandon's eyes lit up. This was exactly the kind of call he loved. He grabbed the radio. Unit 47 responding. En route now. Jessica glanced at him. Brandon, it's probably just someone enjoying the park. You know how Mrs. Henderson is. She calls in a suspicious person every other week. Doesn't matter who called, Brandon said, already pulling out of their spot. We got a call, we respond. That's the job. They arrived at the south side of the park 3 minutes later. Brandon spotted Aisha immediately. Woman in hijab, sitting alone, book in hand, bag beside her. To anyone else, it would look completely normal. To Brandon, it looked like exactly what the caller had described. He got out of the patrol car quickly. Jessica followed a few steps behind, already feeling uncomfortable about how this was going to go. Brandon approached the bench. Aisha noticed him coming but didn't react. She kept reading, though every one of her senses was now heightened. The camera in her bag had a wide-angle lens pointing toward where she sat. It was capturing everything. Afternoon, Brandon said. His tone wasn't friendly. It was the tone cops use when they've already decided you're a problem. Aisha looked up. Good afternoon, officer. Mind if I ask what you're doing here? Brandon said. Aisha gave him a small smile. I'm sitting on a bench in a public park, reading a book, having a nice Saturday afternoon. Brandon's jaw tightened. How long have you been here? About 20 minutes. Why do you ask? We got a call about someone suspicious in the area, Brandon said. So I need to know what you're doing here and how long you're planning to stay. This was already illegal. You can't stop someone and demand information just because someone called them suspicious while they're engaged in perfectly legal activity. Brandon needed reasonable suspicion of a specific crime. Sitting on a bench isn't a crime. Reading a book isn't a crime. But Brandon was operating on a different set of rules. The ones that applied, in his mind, to people who looked like Aisha. Officer, I'm not sure what's suspicious about reading in a park, Aisha said calmly. Could you tell me what specific behavior prompted the call? I don't need to explain my reasons to you, Brandon snapped. When an officer asks you a question, you answer it. That's how this works. Officer Torres stepped closer. Brandon, she said quietly, maybe we should. I got this, Jessica. Brandon cut her off. He turned back to Aisha. Ma'am, I've asked you twice already. What are you doing here? I'm sitting on a bench, Aisha said. Her voice remained level. In a public park. Is that suddenly illegal? Don't get smart with me, Brandon said. His voice was getting louder now. A few people in the park were starting to look over. Multiple people called about someone suspicious in the area. Suspicious? Aisha gestured to her book. I'm literally reading a book. Brandon's face was flushed now. Look, this is a nice neighborhood. Residents here pay good money for their homes. They have a right to feel safe. So I'm gonna need to see some ID and know why you're really here. There it was, the tell. Why you're really here. The implication that Aisha didn't belong, that her presence in this nice neighborhood needed additional justification beyond being a human being in a public space. Officer, Aisha said, her tone still calm but with steel underneath. I don't have to provide ID unless you can articulate reasonable suspicion that I've committed, am committing, or am about to commit a crime. Can you articulate that suspicion? Brandon's hand moved to his belt, not to his gun, but to his cuffs, an intimidation tactic. You're refusing to cooperate with a lawful order. That's obstruction. That's actually not what obstruction means, Aisha said. Obstruction requires me to physically interfere with your duties. Asking you to justify your actions isn't interference. It's my constitutional right. Jessica Torres was now visibly uncomfortable. Brandon, seriously, maybe we should call a supervisor. I don't need a supervisor to handle someone who won't follow simple instructions, Brandon said. He looked back at Aisha. Last chance. ID, now, or you're going in cuffs for obstruction. Have you ever been asked for ID when you weren't doing anything wrong? Comment yes if this has happened to you. Aisha reached slowly into her bag. Brandon's hand moved to his weapon. Slow, he barked. Real slow. I'm reaching for my wallet, Aisha said calmly. Nothing else. She pulled out a leather wallet. Inside was her driver's license, 3 credit cards, and a DOJ credential card that identified her as a federal investigator. She removed only the driver's license and handed it to Brandon. Brandon looked at it. Michigan license. Name Aisha Rahman. The address was in Dearborn, Michigan, which Brandon probably knew had one of the largest Muslim populations in America. He studied it for a long moment, then handed it back. You're a long way from Michigan, he said. What brings you to Denver? I don't have to answer that, Aisha said. You've seen my ID. I've provided what you asked for, though I shouldn't have had to. Am I free to go? Not until I'm satisfied, Brandon said. Satisfied about what? Aisha pressed. What crime do you think I've committed? Brandon was breathing hard now. He knew he was on shaky ground. He knew he should walk away, but his pride wouldn't let him. He'd committed to this stop, and backing down would feel like losing. You're in a public park, in an area that's had security concerns, Brandon said. You've been here alone for a suspicious amount of time. Your behavior fits a pattern we've been told to watch for. What pattern? Aisha asked. And told by whom? Brandon didn't answer that. Because there was no pattern. There were no security concerns. There was nothing except a woman in a hijab sitting on a bench, and that was apparently enough for Brandon to see a threat. I'm going to need to search your bag, Brandon said suddenly. Absolutely not, Aisha replied immediately. You have no probable cause for a search. You have no reasonable suspicion. You have nothing except a phone call from someone who apparently thinks my existence in a park is suspicious. You're not searching anything. If you refuse a search, that gives me reasonable suspicion, Brandon said. That's not how the law works, Aisha said. Asserting my Fourth Amendment rights doesn't create suspicion. That's established case law. Florida v. Bostic, and several others I can cite if you'd like. Brandon's face was red now. Who are you? Some kind of lawyer? Would it matter? Aisha said. Do lawyers get constitutional rights that other people don't? Or should everyone be able to sit in a park without being harassed? Jessica Torres finally stepped forward. Brandon, I really think we should. Jessica, go wait in the car, Brandon snapped. Jessica hesitated. Then she made a decision that would later save her career. She pulled out her phone and started recording. Not obviously, but she held it low, pointed at Brandon and Aisha, capturing audio at minimum. Brandon turned back to Aisha. Stand up, hands behind your back. For what charge? Aisha asked, still seated. Obstruction, failure to comply with lawful orders, disturbing the peace. I'm sitting quietly on a bench. I've complied with your ID request, though it was unlawful. I haven't disturbed anything except your assumptions. Aisha's voice was still calm, but there was an edge now. If you arrest me right now, you will regret it. I'm giving you that warning clearly and on the record. Are you threatening an officer? Brandon said, his hand now actually on his cuffs. I'm advising you that your actions are being documented and will have serious consequences, Aisha said. I'm giving you an opportunity to walk away from a decision that will end your career. Brandon pulled out his cuffs. Stand up, now. Aisha stood. She placed her hands behind her back. She didn't resist. She kept her voice level as Brandon cuffed her. I am not resisting. I am complying under protest. This arrest is unlawful. I am Dr. Aisha Rahman, a federal investigator with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and you are being recorded on equipment that has been transmitting everything to federal servers for the past 12 minutes. Brandon froze. The cuffs were already on one of Aisha's wrists. His hand stopped moving. My credentials are in my wallet, which you already handled, Aisha continued. My bag contains professional recording equipment that has captured every word, every action, every unlawful moment of this encounter. The DOJ has been investigating complaints about this exact type of conduct in your department for 6 months. You have just provided us with perfect evidence. Brandon's face went from red to white. He looked at Jessica, who was still recording on her phone, her expression a mixture of shock and vindication. He looked at the bag on the bench. He looked at the small, professional-looking camera lens that was, now that he noticed it, clearly visible in the open zipper. I didn't know, Brandon started. You didn't ask, Aisha said. You saw a Muslim woman in a hijab and you decided I was suspicious. You violated my constitutional rights based on nothing but my appearance and your bias. And now it's documented in a way that will be used in federal court. Brandon's hands were shaking as he unlocked the cuff he'd already secured. I was just responding to a call that gave you no legal basis for a stop, Aisha said, rubbing her wrist where the cuff had been. No description of criminal activity, no specific threat, just suspicious, which in this neighborhood apparently means a Muslim woman enjoying a public park. Jessica Torres stepped forward. Dr. Rahman, I recorded this encounter on my phone as well. I've been concerned about Officer Cole's behavior for a while now. I want to provide my recording and a statement to your investigation. Brandon's head snapped toward Jessica. What? Jessica, what are you? I'm doing the right thing, Jessica said quietly, something I should have done months ago. If you think Officer Torres did the right thing by recording and reporting, type hero in the comments. Dr. Aisha Rahman filed her report that evening. It was 23 pages long and included video evidence from multiple angles, audio recordings with timestamps, GPS data confirming her location and the timeline, and a detailed legal analysis of each constitutional violation committed during the encounter. She also included Jessica Torres's recording and statement, which corroborated everything and added additional context about Brandon's pattern of behavior. The report went to the DOJ's Civil Rights Division leadership, to the Denver Police Department's Internal Affairs, to the Denver City Attorney's Office, and to the FBI's Civil Rights Division. By Monday morning, Officer Brandon Cole was on administrative leave. By Tuesday, he was officially under federal investigation. The investigation moved quickly because the evidence was ironclad. The recording showed everything. Brandon's unlawful stop based solely on a vague, suspicious person call, his demand for ID without reasonable suspicion, his threat to search without probable cause, his attempt to arrest on false charges, his complete inability to articulate any legal justification for his actions. But the investigation didn't stop with just that encounter. The DOJ pulled everything. Brandon's body camera footage from every shift for the past 3 years, his written reports, his dispatch logs, his arrest records. They analyzed it all, looking for patterns. What they found was damning. In 3 years, Brandon had stopped or questioned 63 individuals he described in reports as suspicious or possibly surveilling. Of those 63, 58 were visibly Muslim, either wearing hijabs or traditional Islamic clothing. Of those 58 stops, exactly 0 resulted in any criminal charges. 0. Not a single arrest. Not a single citation. Just harassment. They also found his body camera footage from those encounters. The way he spoke to Muslim residents was markedly different from how he spoke to everyone else. More aggressive, more demanding, more suspicious. The contrast was stark when you watched the footage back to back. One video showed Brandon stopping a Muslim woman leaving a grocery store, demanding to search her bags because she looked nervous. She consented because she was terrified, and he found nothing but groceries. He never apologized. Another showed him questioning a Muslim man walking his dog in the park, asking what he was really doing in the neighborhood and running his name through multiple databases. The man lived 2 blocks away. He'd been walking that same route every morning for 5 years. The pattern was undeniable. Brandon had been engaging in systematic religious discrimination for years, and nobody had stopped him because nobody had been looking closely enough until the DOJ started looking. And when they looked, they found even more than just Brandon's misconduct. They found his supervisors who'd ignored warning signs. They found complaints that had been dismissed without proper investigation. They found a system that had protected discriminatory behavior instead of stopping it. Sergeant Tom Brennan had been Brandon's direct supervisor for 2 years. When the DOJ interviewed him, he admitted he'd noticed Brandon seemed to stop more Middle Eastern types than other officers. But Brennan said he'd never thought it was a problem because Brandon always had a reason for his stops. Except Brandon's reasons were consistently pretextual and unsupported by evidence. Suspicious behavior that turned out to be normal activities, matching descriptions of suspects in crimes that didn't exist or had already been solved, security concerns in neighborhoods with no actual security issues. The DOJ asked Brennan why he'd never questioned these patterns, why he'd never pulled Brandon's stop data, why he'd never reviewed the body camera footage from these encounters. Brennan didn't have good answers. The truth was, he hadn't wanted to look. Looking would have required action. Action would have created conflict, so he'd look the other way. Sergeant Brennan was demoted and transferred to a desk job. He took early retirement 6 months later. The DOJ also uncovered something particularly disturbing in their review of internal affairs files. Remember those 47 complaints from Muslim residents? When investigators looked at how those complaints had been handled, they found a clear pattern of inadequate investigation. One complaint came from a Muslim woman named Yasmin Hassan. She'd been stopped by Brandon while leaving a mosque after Friday prayers. Brandon had demanded to know where she was going, asked to see inside her purse, questioned her about the mosque and who attended services there. Yasmin had filed a detailed complaint, including the date, time, location, and Brandon's badge number. The internal affairs investigation consisted of reading Brandon's report, which claimed he'd stopped her because her vehicle matched a description of a car involved in a hit and run that had occurred 3 weeks earlier, asking Brandon if he'd acted appropriately. He said yes, and closing the case as unfounded without ever interviewing Yasmin or reviewing any body camera footage. When DOJ investigators pulled Brandon's body camera from that day, they found the entire encounter recorded. Yasmin's vehicle looked nothing like the hit and run suspect vehicle, which was actually a truck. Brandon never asked about the hit and run. He focused entirely on where she'd been and what she was doing at the mosque. The body camera footage completely contradicted his written report. Internal Affairs had never bothered to watch it. The DOJ found this pattern repeated across multiple complaints, cursory investigations, automatic credibility given to officer statements, little to no effort to gather evidence or interview complainants. The system wasn't designed to find misconduct. It was designed to dismiss complaints. The Internal Affairs lieutenant who'd overseen these investigations, Lieutenant Mark Davison, was interviewed by the DOJ. He defended his work, claiming limited resources meant IA had to prioritize complaints that seemed most serious. When asked how he determined seriousness without investigating, he couldn't provide a clear answer. Lieutenant Davison was also demoted. He filed a grievance with the police union, claiming he was being scapegoated for systemic problems. The grievance was denied. Davison resigned. Here's something crazy. Drop emoji in the comments if you're shocked by how deep this cover-up went. The Denver Police Department's Internal Affairs Division conducted its own investigation parallel to the federal one. Their findings mirrored the DOJ's. Brandon had violated departmental policies on bias-free policing, constitutional standards for stops and searches, proper documentation of encounters, and professional conduct. The investigation recommended immediate termination. But the internal report went further. It found that Brandon's pattern of discrimination had been reasonably observable by his supervisors, and that the failure to identify and address it constituted negligent supervision. It found that Internal Affairs had failed in its duty to properly investigate complaints, and it found that department training on religious discrimination and bias-free policing had been inadequate and poorly enforced. In other words, Brandon didn't act alone. He operated within a system that enabled and protected his behavior. Brandon was fired 3 weeks after the encounter in the park. The termination letter was blunt. Your conduct demonstrated a clear pattern of discrimination based on religion and national origin. You violated the constitutional rights of numerous individuals. You brought discredit to this department. Your actions are indefensible, and your termination is necessary to maintain public trust. But the consequences went far beyond Brandon losing his job, because the DOJ investigation didn't stop with one officer. They expanded it to look at the entire department's handling of Muslim community complaints. They found that 47 complaints had been filed over 18 months, and 44 of those had been marked unfounded or unsubstantiated without proper investigation. The DOJ's final report, released 6 months after Aisha's encounter in the park, was 186 pages long. It found systematic failures in how the Denver Police Department handled complaints about religious discrimination. It found inadequate training on bias-free policing. It found supervisors who failed to identify and address obvious patterns. It found a culture that tolerated discriminatory behavior. The DOJ entered into a consent decree with Denver, requiring sweeping reforms, mandatory bias training for all officers, new policies on stops and searches, requirements to document and justify every stop, creation of a community oversight board with real power, and 5 years of federal monitoring to ensure compliance. All of this because Brandon Cole saw a woman in a hijab sitting on a bench and decided that was suspicious. Brandon tried to fight his termination. He hired an attorney, he filed an appeal, he claimed he was just doing his job, responding to calls, keeping the community safe. But the evidence was overwhelming. The videos didn't lie, the patterns didn't lie, the 58 stops of Muslim individuals with 0 criminal findings didn't lie. His appeal was denied, his termination stood, and just like the officer in our previous story, Brandon found himself unhireable in law enforcement. He applied to 19 different agencies. All of them rejected him. Federal discrimination findings make you radioactive in any police department that wants to avoid liability. Brandon now works as a night security guard at a parking garage. He makes $16 an hour. No benefits, no pension, no future. His marriage fell apart under the stress. His kids see him every other weekend. The career he spent 14 years building evaporated in 12 minutes on a Saturday afternoon in a park. Some people say that's too harsh, that everyone makes mistakes, that he didn't physically hurt anyone. But Dr. Aisha Rahman put it best in her testimony during the consent decree hearings. This wasn't a mistake. Mistakes are accidental. This was a choice. Officer Cole chose to see me as a threat because of my religion. He chose to violate my rights. He chose to ignore the law. And he made that same choice at least 58 times over 3 years. The only mistake was that he finally chose to do it to someone who had the power to hold him accountable. Dr. Rahman continued her work with the DOJ. She's since led investigations in 4 more cities, all resulting in reforms. She's become a leading expert on religious discrimination in policing. She speaks at police academies, teaching officers how to recognize their own biases and how to police without violating constitutional rights. Officer Jessica Torres was promoted to sergeant 2 years after the incident. She's now part of the department's bias-free policing training team. She teaches new officers about the importance of speaking up when they see wrong behavior from their partners. The video she recorded that day is used in training sessions, showing how one officer's decision to document and report saved her career while protecting her integrity. The woman who called 911 that day, the one who reported Aisha as suspicious, was never publicly identified, but she was interviewed as part of the investigation. She admitted she'd called because she didn't recognize Aisha and thought it was strange to see someone in a hijab in her park. She didn't think she'd done anything wrong. She still doesn't. She represents a problem that goes beyond police, a community that sees certain people as inherently suspicious, that demands their removal from public spaces, that uses law enforcement as a tool to enforce their biases. But the incident in the park changed how Denver PD responds to those calls. Now, when someone calls in a suspicious person who's doing nothing but existing in a public space, dispatchers are trained to ask specific questions. What crime is being committed? What specific behavior is threatening? Is this person actually doing anything illegal, or do they just look different from you? And officers are trained to think critically before responding to those calls. Because sitting on a bench isn't suspicious. Reading a book isn't suspicious. Wearing a hijab isn't suspicious. And treating any of those things as suspicious is discrimination, not policing. The bench where Aisha was sitting that day is still in Washington Park. There's no plaque, no memorial, no indication of what happened there. But for the Muslim community in Denver, it's become something of a symbol. People post pictures sitting on it, holding books, simply existing in public space without fear. It's a small act of defiance and reclamation. That's what happens when you assume someone doesn't belong based solely on how they look or what they believe. That's what happens when you let bias override law and common sense. That's what happens when you think your badge gives you the right to harass people for existing while different. 12 minutes in a park cost Brandon Cole everything. His career, his pension, his reputation, his future in law enforcement, and it all could have been avoided if he'd simply asked himself one question before approaching that bench. What crime am I investigating? The answer was none. There was no crime. There was only a woman reading a book, and that should have been the end of it. If this story opened your eyes to something important, share it. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see more stories about accountability and justice. Drop a comment telling me what you learned. And remember, everyone has the right to exist in public spaces without being harassed. Everyone, no exceptions. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.